Let me first introduce myself. My name is Martin Muschol. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Physics. The experience about online teaching I want to share with you is really based on teaching the second part of a graduate level course, biophysics course, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it is definitely a limited experience and specific to the small class I taught. And so one has to keep that in mind in terms of the approach I took and the methods I used. The approach I used was to go for an asynchronous delivery of the content to reach my students and combine that with online office hours, which all students had to participate in to keep them engaged. I think one thing to keep in mind about this entire topic of online teaching is we want to optimize the benefits to the students, but at the same time, we have to be conscious of the time limitations, particularly on research active faculty, because this is not the only requirement for our job. Therefore, we have to be efficient about it, and it doesn't help if we have 20 different tools of which we have to learn anew. We need to really streamline the process and have a minimum of maybe 2 or 3 tools that we use and we use effectively and can integrate with Canvas. So as I pointed out, I used PowerPoint to deliver the content that I wanted to get to my students. And it is a standard PowerPoint presentation, but the slideshow menu allows you to provide a voiceover for any given PowerPoint slide. So I basically provided a narration of the PowerPoint slides to the students. The advantages of this approach is that students can study this material at their own pace and more or less at their own time, even so there's a somewhat constraint of how quickly I could generate these presentations because it was actually a rather time-consuming process, which is one of the disadvantages. It provides uniform class notes to the students. It can be nicely integrated by targeting then homework problems and or quizzes to students to refer to specific aspects of what I presented. And it kind of represents, in conjunction with the office hours to discuss later, in almost just-in-time teaching methods, where the material is given to the students up front, and then we can use at least part of the class time to address questions that students have about that material and use that class time basically to discuss this material. The disadvantages, as I already mentioned, was that generating these PowerPoint slides, particularly when you have to include graphics, when you don't teach a course that has just a standard textbook with lots of support material, it was a very time-consuming process. Recording the voiceover, I found, was also time-consuming because instead of speaking freely like I would in my lectures with just using some handwritten or typed out notes, I really had to develop a script that I followed so that the presentation was reasonably smooth and there weren't too many breaks in between. The other aspect is that, of course, you don't have immediate feedback from the students about how they perceive or how they absorb this material. There's a couple of improvements to this approach. Kevin Yee pointed out to me that there's a tool called Kaltura that allows you to incorporate questions and quizzes within a PowerPoint presentation. It does it in a way that you basically generate the PowerPoint presentation, just as noticed, like I mentioned before, but by uploading it into Kaltura, you can then insert specific questions at given points that the students have to address before they can move on. And you can even record these responses and incorporate them into your gradebook. So you can make that as a low stakes kind of reward / carrot feedback to the students to make them follow the material and remain engaged. You could also, as I mentioned, use the original face-to-face time that students should have reserved in their schedule to then address the material you presented in the PowerPoint and basically use that as an effective class time where students can pose questions and you answer. You have basically a Q&A session about the presentation and about the issues that they might have had with it. One possible improvement in terms of reducing the time demands on the instructor would be to use a document camera and actually write out the notes, which I think still is a lot easier, particularly if you have a lot of formulas and graphs like you have in or chemistry or mathematics or physics, to help reduce the amount of time you spend just formatting the presentation. I haven't tried that, but I think that might be one way I would go if I have to do this in the fall, which is quite likely. Regarding the interactions with the students, I relied on MS Teams to arrange kind of compulsory online office hours to discuss materials and questions related to the class material and or homework that might have arisen. The advantages are clearly that it's readily available to you students. MS Teams also doesn't seem to suffer too much from drop-off due to internet connection problems, so it's not as problematic as synchronous delivery of material. If someone misses a question, they can still follow up the answers. You might even be able to type them out. It definitely provides more direct interaction than using email interactions, so I like that. It can therefore actually be used to limit email questions, which I think particularly for introductory courses is quite important because you get overwhelmed with emails from students. You can answer frequently asked questions to many of the students at the same time. So again, having this as a compulsory office hours might actually help to improve absorption of the material by the students. And it compels the students to engage with the material. You can even make it so that they have to pose a certain number of questions throughout the semester to get, again, some extra credit. The disadvantage remains that it's still not quite the same as a face-to-face contact where students have the chance to immediately ask questions. It's not clear so that unless you kind of make a typo or you just miss a critical part of the explanation, that students in general ask that many questions in class. So having time to absorb the material and then ask a question, if you can get them to do it, might actually be a more efficient way. The last topic I wanted to address was related to exams. And here I have less to say for the general public because I chose to have my students write a term paper and prepare an online presentation that they had to record, a PowerPoint presentation with a voiceover. And that was what I used as my final exam. That had the advantage that, you know, they had to go to a specific article that they had to review, and I had the time to see whether they actually followed this and or just copied off the internet. So it was easy to kind of see how faithful they really followed my instructions and whether they did a good job. There was not much room for cheating. How this is done in larger classes, I think I have little to say about, and I'm actually kind of curious to see what other faculty have done to address this issue. So this is really all I wanted to share with you, and I hope this was concise enough without taking too much of your time.